6 years ago, families in Marinette and Peshtigo, Wisconsin, got the news that would change everything for them and eventually the whole state.
We received a letter and it explained about the contamination in the underground water.
PFAS from firefighting foam produced at nearby Tyco Fire Products had infiltrated groundwater, creeks, streams, and drinking water wells across the area.
I don't let my grandchildren bathe here anymore. And we wash all the dishes with the bottled water.
We're all standing on contaminated property. We don't know what the long-term effects of our health are. This is a crisis of contamination.
Now, researchers say that contamination plume has made its way into Green Bay. What needs to happen next as forever chemicals threaten the largest freshwater system in the world, our Great Lakes? I'm Amy Barrio, and this is State of Change from Clean Wisconsin. Since 2019, UW-Madison researchers have been testing sediment and water in 41 tributaries of Green Bay and Lake Michigan to understand how a group of harmful man-made chemicals called PFAS are accumulating in our environment. You can find the chemicals in all kinds of consumer products, from nonstick cookware to jackets and shoes to fast food wrappers. But researchers say they know exactly where the compounds in Green Bay are coming from. Joining me is Dr. Christy Remicall, an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at UW-Madison. Your team has linked PFAS chemicals found in the waters of Green Bay to Tyco Fire Products miles away in Marinette by searching for, some key active ingredients.
Yeah, we found the active ingredients in a lot of different places. So that was one way of linking the contamination, like with Green Bay with Tyco, as well as contamination near fields treated with biosolids. We found those active ingredients there as well. That was one piece of the puzzle, and the other piece was looking at the other compounds, things like PFOS, PFOA, kind of the usual suspects. We used like a fingerprinting approach where it's the relative amounts of these different PFAS chemicals. And again, the relative amount comes back to how these chemicals were made. And a manufacturer like Tyco, the kinds of PFAS are going to be really different than a different type of manufacturer. In this case, the fingerprint of what we saw in like nearshore Green Bay was basically identical to what's leaving Tyco. It was actually so close. It was a little bit of a surprise that they were that similar, but there was really no question that it's coming from the same place.
And I guess, that's what most people would have assumed anyway. Why is it important for your research to give a more definitive link?
Right, you're absolutely right. I don't think any of the findings in the study are a surprise. It's like, well, groundwater there is contaminated. Of course, the groundwater is going to keep going into Green Bay. That's just the way water works. So it's not a surprise. Being able to directly link it, I think, is important for kind of hopefully figuring out how to clean it up, who's going to take care of it eventually, which of course is a really complicated topic, which I'm going to stay out of as much as possible, but it hopefully gives some information about that, although it's pretty obvious. That's the way the groundwater is flowing. It also has really important implications for our lakes, like Lake Michigan. I think this is probably a pretty large source of PFAS to Green Bay, and it's something we need to think about when we're trying to prevent contamination from getting in the Great Lakes in the first place.
You're a water chemist. You have spent your entire career looking at different kinds of chemicals and how they behave in water. What makes PFAS so special or so different than some of these other chemicals?
Oh yeah, PFAS they're problematic for many, many different reasons. So first, they're really persistent. Something like PFOS or PFOA don't have any known natural degradation processes in the environment, and so they last a really, really long time. Second, some of these chemicals bioaccumulate, so they build up within the food chain. This is why we see fish advisories for PFAS and things like that. Once they're in your body, it takes time for them to leave again. The health effects associated with PFAS happen at really, really low concentrations, so that's another big concern. When we're talking about PFAS, we're talking about parts per trillion concentrations that are relevant for human health, and that's tiny. It's like a drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Like, it is small. Just for comparison, arsenic is allowed to be in our drinking water at concentrations like 500 times higher. And we're talking about low levels. And these low levels are everywhere. PFAS are persistent. They're also really mobile in the environment. They dissolve in water. They go wherever water goes. And you find them all over the place. So that's kind of a laundry list, but there's a lot of things about PFAS that are tricky and, really concerning.
I think there's a lot to unpack with respect to PFAS. So when we say PFAS, we're talking about a big class of chemicals, thousands of different kinds. The EPA is on the verge of setting standards for just two of those, called PFOA and PFOS, which you've mentioned looking for and finding in Green Bay. What about all those others, though? I mean, many of these chemicals are still in use. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's such an important point. When I say PFAS, I'm referring to over 6,000 chemicals. We don't actually know how many there are. And it's, we measured, in this study, we measured 24 of them, which, it's a small piece of the puzzle. The routine measurements at the state lab, they measure 34, and that's what we're doing now in our lab too, but it's still 34 out of 6,000 plus. It's not a lot. We don't know, for the vast majority of these chemicals, we don't know their toxic effects. We don't know their environmental fate. We really know it for a few compounds. Things like PFOS and PFOA, those are really prevalent. You find them everywhere. They have known toxicity. They're very, very persistent, and that's why there's so much focus on them. They're, those are the ones that are driving a lot of the regulations, but there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of people in my field who are, talk about like, we should think about regulating these chemicals as a class. That's hard to do from a toxicity standpoint, developing like water regulations because you don't know the toxicity of most of them. But thinking about what goes into our products and things like that, maybe that does make a lot of sense. We should just avoid these chemicals as much as possible. I think what's happened a lot is, we're like, hey, PFOA, PFOS, those are bad. Don't use those. And they're like, okay. How about this one instead? It's a little shorter. It's a different chemical, but you look at it and like, it's not going to be that different, you guys. Just swapping out one chemical from another isn't getting us where we need to go. So we do need to think about maybe a class perspective. Some of these other, trying to just avoid using these organofluorine chemicals in general. That's hard. They're so useful and they're used in so many different things. So it's hard to kind of get your head around that.
When we talk about safety, the last time I talked to you, there was an EPA health advisory level, the recommended level for these chemicals in drinking water, of 70 parts per trillion for those two compounds, PFOA and PFOS combined. They've since lowered that, though, to single-digit parts per trillion, these ultra-trace levels. And now we're looking at the possibility that the EPA's first enforceable limits for PFAS under the Safe Drinking Water Act, expected in a couple of months, will again be in that single-digit parts per trillion range, perhaps the lowest regulation ever for a chemical compound. Does this seem kind of crazy to think about where we are right now compared to just a few years ago?
That's a really great question. You're right. Parts per trillion is tiny. 70 nanograms per liter, even that's a low number compared to many of our drinking water regulations. Although many people in the PFAS community are like 70 is really, really high. And the new EPA health advisory is parts per quadrillion, which is a number I had never even thought of before. Like, we can't measure that low on our instrumentation. Like, I don't think there's water on the planet that's below the current EPA health advisory. A couple nanograms per liter, that's in everything. It's going to be interesting to see what they come up with. And depending on where they set it, there could be the majority of drinking water sources would be above that. And then how do you treat that? How do you deal with that? The cost, balancing all that. It'll be interesting to see when that comes out. It's going to have really big implications.
Going back to Marinette and Peshtigo, I know Tyco is, I think, right now implementing a big, huge treatment system right there at the source. But what does that mean for the existing contamination that's already made its way into, Green Bay and beyond?
Yeah, the genie's sort of out of the bottle a little bit. The Great Lakes are huge, right? Once you've put PFAS in the Great Lakes, what can you do? You can't treat all that water. There's no way to do it. So the real long-term solution is how do we prevent contamination from getting there in the first place. But once it's in the Great Lakes, I really don't know what you can do. Like it's out there. When you sort of zoom in a little bit more and you think about, okay, not on site, but maybe that big groundwater plume, there may be ways to kind of capture that groundwater or treat it. Treating groundwater it's expensive. It takes a really long time. PFAS remediation is also really, we have ways of like getting PFAS from water like onto activated carbon or different types of filtration systems, but we don't have really good ways of destroying the chemicals. People have tried doing things like incineration that has concerns about energy usage and also some of the byproducts that you make. That's not a silver bullet either. So we're not there yet, but there's so much. I think the more optimistic way to think about it is that there's so much work going on to try to develop things that will work. Like so many people across the world are working on it that I think we'll get there.
It's so funny, though, because, I think of all these people across the world who are working on solving the problem of PFAS. And then I also think about all the chemical manufacturers across the world that are producing PFAS at the same time. It feels like this weird cycle where nothing can be solved.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we never learn. I mean, we talked about this earlier, but, you switch from the 8-chain PFOS, PFOA to shorter chain compounds. And you're like, that's going to cause problems too. And it's, something like Tyco, we know some of their old active ingredients, but we don't know the new ones. Like we're on the scientific front always trying to catch up with what are they making? How is that new chemical behaving? Every time they switch formulations, like now what's happening? What's that toxicity? Like we're trying to catch up with them. It's sort of, we are kind of chasing tails in a way. It's really, I mean, looking at these chemicals from just like an environmental chemist's perspective, why would you put these out in the environment? They're going to cause so many problems. Just looking at the structure, it's going to be bad, but we don't learn. People don't learn.
I don't want to go back down a separate rabbit hole, but I did want to go back to the biosolids issue. So biosolids are basically waste from sewage treatment plants that are spread really on crops like corn and things like that all across the state of Wisconsin. And your research has shown, at least up in the Marinette, Peshtigo areas, that contamination from Tyco is in the biosolids spread on some of these crops. Is that basically summarizing it?
Yes, exactly. So, and there's been a lot of, I think, finger pointing on this issue. But yeah, biosolids in general, it's a great idea. You're capturing all these resources that are in our waste that we literally flush down the toilet and using these nutrients and using them as fertilizer. And so from a like green perspective or sustainability perspective, that's kind of a cool idea to do that. The problem, of course, is that if you have a chemical contamination, something like PFAS in your biosolids, not only are you taking those nutrients, but now you're taking the PFAS and then you're putting those on your crops, and that's kind of where the problem comes in. So in the Marinette and Peshtigo region, they stopped land applying biosolids in 2018. But these chemicals last a really long time, and so we did find evidence of the active ingredients associated with Tyco near fields treated with biosolids. So there is sort of a direct link there, which was pretty interesting to find that.
How are the chemicals getting into the biosolids?
Oh boy. So I think, Tyco I don't know the status of like what they're doing with their wastewater and kind of how that's all managed now, but I think in the past that was sent to their municipal wastewater treatment plant. At least some of the waste was. In the wastewater treatment plant, you treat the water and you have your solids, which are made up of bacteria and then also fecal matter and all that sort of stuff. And that basically is processed in a way so it's no longer stinky and gross, but it's more like fertilizer you can use. We often talk about wastewater treatment plants when we're thinking about PFAS. They don't make PFAS, but they also don't remove PFAS that come in. So anything that comes in is going to come out the wastewater treatment plant on the other side, either in the water or in the solids. And so, it's just they're coming into the wastewater treatment plant, and that's how they end up in the biosolids.
I mean, would you be surprised if biosolids coming from wastewater treatment facilities all over the place have some detectable level of PFAS in them?
No, I'm sure they all have some, but it's kind of we don't have regulations or anything for them. If you have like an industrial source, I know Michigan has seen this a lot, some of their sewer sheds when they have industrial sources releasing PFAS, they find a lot of PFAS in their wastewater treatment plants. And other places it's a lot lower. So knowing what's a safe level versus what's not, I don't think we know. Are they going to be in biosolids? Yes. So for sure, they're going to be found everywhere. I think we've only measured, I think one sediment sample we measured 0 PFAS. You always find it. We're talking about low levels, and we can measure really low. So I think you'll find it everywhere. I think what we need to figure out sort of more broadly is like what's okay and what's not to use.
Can these crops kind of pull up the PFAS? I mean, is there a way that the corn or the animal feed is going to be contaminated if it's had these biosolids on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's an ongoing area of research as well.
It feels like everything that we're talking about, the PFAS in the sediment, in biosolids, in Green Bay, in the lake, is too late. That we're at the very end of the problem when it actually has made its way into our environment. What progress are you seeing being made at the beginning, which in terms of the manufacture and use of these chemicals?
I mean, I think going forward, it has to be all about source reduction and kind of preventing it from getting out there. But you're right, a lot of times it's already there. PFAS have been measured everywhere. The whole planet. It's a global issue. It's not just a Marinette issue or it's everywhere. So I think there's just a lot more awareness now and a lot more sensitivity. People know this is an issue. It's a thing. It's going to be something we deal with. So I think people know we can't just wash our firefighting foam off into the groundwater. We're going to have to do something about it. So I think that's good. It's a lot later than I think many people would have liked. There's a lot of contamination out there we're going to be dealing with for a very long time.
Thank you so much for talking with me. It's always kind of depressing, but really good to get this information out there, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
In Fitchburg, Wisconsin, fire departments are turning in truckloads of PFAS firefighting foam to an environmental waste management company. It's part of a new DNR program launched in October that so far has collected some 10,000 gallons of the chemicals from departments across the state. All that waste is headed to Alabama, where it will be mixed into concrete blocks and stored in a hazmat landfill. Joining me is Dr. Paul Mathewson, Clean Wisconsin Science Program Director. Collection is obviously important, but I think that this shows us there's no real solution here. There's no way to get rid of these forever chemicals in firefighting foam or anything else. And people may not realize that this goes beyond firefighting foam and water, the things that usually make headlines. There are all kinds of ways that all of us are being exposed to PFAS.
You hear about water contamination and you think that's your main source of exposure. And for a person living in a contaminated area, that the drinking water is contaminated, that is a major source. But for most folks, it is not water. For most people, water might be 20% of your exposure. Your greatest exposure is through consumer products, particularly food packaging, eating food that's been in contact with, a wrapper or some kind of packaging that has PFAS in it. That's what's thought to be the primary route of exposure. That, and then consumer products like your waterproof rainwear, your dental floss, your stain-resistant carpeting or upholstery. As that wears, that's gonna, little particles are getting in your house dust and you breathe that in, and that's another major route for most folks who aren't drinking contaminated water.
Instead of seeing fewer and fewer products containing PFAS, we're actually, it seems like, seeing more and more. So, more and more of those cool jackets that are breathable and water resistant, more and more of, stain resistant. I was buying a comforter the other day, and there was some that were now stain resistant comforter. It feels like PFAS are being used more and more, even as we're learning more and more about their health impacts. When you see that, what goes through your mind as someone who kind of knows that we don't even have a great understanding of what these chemicals are or how they interact with our bodies?
On the bright side, I think there are a lot of companies who are forward-looking. I know Patagonia and other companies like Keen, and the footwear company. There's a number of companies who are working hard to look at their supply chain and do what they can to minimize or eliminate or at least minimize the use of PFAS in their supply chains. But it's just so prevalent, and the more we can make people aware of what to look for and what to avoid, I think that's helpful.
So what are the kinds of products that people should maybe think twice about buying?
Anything that's stain resistant or water resistant or stick free, those sorts of things are gonna have PFAS or PFAS-like compounds in them. And so those you wanna just look around and see if there's any kind of labeling that's saying we're PFAS free or fluorine compound free. There's a bunch of different phrases that are out there. But again, things that are stain resistant, non-stick, those are the products that are consumer products that are gonna be most likely to have these compounds.
So some labels will say something like PFOA free or PFOS free, but that is not exactly what we're looking for. Is that right?
Right. So those are just specific compounds. Like we said, there's thousands of them, and anything manufactured in the U.S. isn't going to have PFOA and PFOS because there's at least a ban in the U.S. But imported stuff may still have PFOA and PFOS. But just because it says PFOA, PFOS free, that doesn't mean it doesn't have one of the thousands of the other PFAS chemicals in there. Again, we can't say they're all as harmful as PFOA, PFOS. Most of them have not been studied at all. So just, precautionary principles to avoid it as much as you can.
Does it feel kind of like we're swimming against the tide a little bit? We don't use PFOA or PFOS anymore in this country, but yet these chemicals are still being manufactured as a class. There's no labeling requirement. There's no disclosure requirement for chemical companies or manufacturers. What is the big thing that needs to happen in your mind to kind of push forward just a little bit on some of this kind of onslaught of these chemicals in our consumer products?
Yeah, I think the interest of consumers and consumer health needs to be a higher priority in the approval of the use of all these chemicals, because right now my understanding is it's fairly easy to get a new PFAS compound approved for use and things. And so I think strengthening whatever process is there to put the health of society, higher on the list of priorities would be helpful. I've seen movements to regulate PFAS as a class rather than individual compounds, just because, in certain respects they're similar. Right now, having to work on these things compound by compound is just an insurmountable task, especially when you're talking thousands of them. We worked so hard, we worked for years just to get 2 regulations for 2 of them. When you think about extrapolating that out to thousands of them, we can't continue to do it compound by compound, and researchers can't test and evaluate each individual compound to see which ones are toxic and which ones are not. And so I think a class-based approach has to be in the works in order to kind of wrap our arms around this problem as a whole.
Paul Mathewson, Science Program Director at Clean Wisconsin. For more information about PFAS in our state, log on to cleanwisconsin.org. I'm Mimi Barrio, and this has been State of Change from Clean Wisconsin.